Global warming is indeed happening. That's the finding of two recent detailed scientific studies and offered as tangible proof, the indication that this year will be the hottest ever recorded. What is the impact of the rising temperature on the planet and its people? And how can governments help stop or limit the damage? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Heat wave in Europe, parts of the United States baking, some countries in Asia setting new high temperature records this year, Africa experiencing the same. Some researchers are convinced this is not an aberration, but rather a trend. It's not just a heat wave, but global warming. They say the planet has been warming for the last half century, and since the 1980s, every decade on Earth has been hotter than the previous one. They've listed 10 key planet-wide indicators of a world growing hotter. Some of them are higher temperatures over land and oceans, higher humidity, higher near-surface air temperatures. By near-surface, they mean the troposphere. It's the lowest part of the atmosphere where Earth's weather occurs. And higher sea levels, and possibly related to this, melting glaciers and less sea ice. Compiled into a report based on tangible data from countries around the world, the research does not go into the causes of this change, but what it does say is that there's no doubt that the global climate is changing. Well, joining us to discuss this issue are our guests. In London, Fred Pearce from the New Scientist magazine, and also in London, David Henderson. He's former head of the Economics and Statistics Department at OECD, and chairman of the Academic Advisory Council of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Well, let's begin with Fred Pearce. The science in this report appears to be very solid. Do you believe it settles the argument on the existence of global warming once and for all?
I don't think it settles the argument about whether humans are causing global warming. Some people will still continue to contest that. But the longer the warming goes on, we've had fairly consistent warming for the last 40 years now. And the longer it goes on, and the longer that what we might call the skeptics don't come up with a convincing alternative explanation for that warming, the more likely it looks that it is human-caused warming. And scientists would expect that, because we know we're putting these heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. You'd expect warming, and that's what we're seeing. So I don't think it'll end the argument. And we're going to always have fluctuations in warming. It's very dangerous to say that a particular heat wave is caused by global warming. We've always had natural variability, and that will carry on. But the general trend does look increasingly like man-made global warming. And if that's the case, then the more gases we put into the atmosphere, the more warming we're going to get.
David Henderson, your view on these recent reports?
I can't comment on the reports because I'm not a climate scientist. I doubt whether it's the case, however, that your introduction seemed rather to presume that this might settle the debate. I think the debate will continue among scientists, even though the report does probably reflect a majority view. But I shall simply watch the debate as an interested lay person. I can't actually comment on the reports as an expert.
Well, for the record, the report itself is not dealing with causes, as has been pointed out. It is dealing with tangible data that has been collated from all parts of the world, probably the most detailed report that has been compiled for a long period of time. To go back to Fred Pearce, the issue once again that you made there, that there is no cause, there is no debate about cause within these reports. That is left for another time. But the indications, as you pointed out, is that there has to be some human interference in the process. Could you clarify that?
Well, it looks like that. I mean, the main outside forces that would change the temperature on the sort of timescales we're talking about would be changes in solar activity. Obviously, all our heat ultimately comes from the sun, and changes to volcanic activity, which can have a very big effect shading the planet and therefore cooling us to some extent. But the last 30 or 40 years show no evidence that either of those two forces ought to have been causing warming. In fact, that natural variability would have likely been causing some cooling over that time. Now, we can't discount that there is some natural variability within the climate system, if you like. Heat moving from the oceans to the atmosphere and backwards and forwards, that could have an effect. But the oceans are warming too, so it looks like the atmosphere and the oceans are warming. So it all begins to stack up to look as if the real change that's going on is humans adding these greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide from burning coal and oil, adding those into the atmosphere. We know we're doing that. We know they're accumulating. We've been measuring that for 60 years now. So it all, as I say, begins to add up. As any scientist would say, well, the obvious explanation for what's going on is these human influences. And I think we have to take that as the presumption and work out what we're going to do about it. How long are we going to allow this warming to go on? How much warming is going to be safe, or have we passed a danger threshold already, maybe? You know, what are we going to do about this? Because the one certainty is that these gases, they don't disappear quickly once you've put them in the atmosphere. They can stay there for many centuries. So the more we put into the atmosphere, the more it accumulates, the more warming we're going to get. And that does look like one of the really critical issues for humanity and for our society in the 21st century. And we've got to face up to that.
David Henderson, do you think that human activity as a cause of global warming is a fair assumption?
You may be right in saying that this is a huge problem which we have to face up to, and that is certainly the view of almost every government around the world. To repeat, I can't comment on this report or the scientific aspects, though I would say that you seem to assume that the facts that it presents are facts which everyone must accept, and I'd rather wait and see whether that proves to be the case. I think the extent of disagreement among experts may be rather greater than you implied. However, my position is different. I'm not a climate scientist. I came into this subject entirely by accident, with no preconceptions, and I've presumed, as I think you presume, and Fred presumes as a much more expert person than I am about the science, I presumed that governments were right in identifying a serious problem and right in thinking that the basis of which they were acting, the fact that the problem was serious, had been revealed by a careful process of expert inquiry, of which this new report is part. And I've come to the conclusion that this whole expert process, which governments have placed so much trust over a period of 20 years or so, is seriously flawed, and in fact, in important respects, has shown itself not up to professional standards.
Why would you believe that it's seriously flawed, if I could just interrupt you, David? Why do you think it is flawed?
I've got quite a long list, of which I'll give you a selection. I'll only say that A, it's a selection, and B, that I made the list before the revelations that came out about the conduct of some prominent climate scientists and their associates through the release of emails from the University of East Anglia, the so-called Climate Gate. Three aspects. One, I think, is over-reliance on in-group peer review process, which doesn't necessarily provide for due disclosure of sources and procedures. Second, serious and continuing failures of disclosure in relation to peer-reviewed studies which governments and the Intergovernmental Panel have drawn on and paid serious attention to. And third, mishandling of data through failure to involve trained statisticians. All these flaws have been exposed and not owned up to, not recognised, not acknowledged, still less remedied by the people who are running this whole process.
Fred Pearce, a detailed list of flaws within the process. Your view of that position?
I think some of those flaws have emerged, some from the emails. I've written quite a lot about the Climate Gate saga, and it does show up some shortcomings in what the scientists are doing. But that really doesn't damage too much the big story. Yes, scientists are imperfect. Yes, scientists don't always own up to the failings of their research and the uncertainties in their research. And absolutely, there are quite considerable uncertainties in how climate change is going to play out. The trouble with that is if you say, well, we're going to wait until all the uncertainties are resolved, you're going to be waiting quite a long time, probably till the events actually happen. And that's very dangerous because, you know, we are dealing with fundamental processes here.
Well, David Henderson, you wanted to get a word in there.
I didn't say that. I didn't say no action should be taken. And my personal view is that on the basis of the advice they've been given, governments almost certainly should take action. Now, I'm critical of some of the things they're doing. I'm also saying something more. I'm saying that we're here dealing with a system of extraordinary complexity, the properties of which are not well known. Much remains to be found out. And that in that situation, and where so much is at stake on both sides, the risks are not just on one side, the expert inquiries which governments commission and listen to should be professionally watertight, and the whole process should be more open and objective than it is now. And as a start, very specific, something which should have been done years ago. The next report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change should start from the presumption, and the instruction indeed, government should approve this, that no piece of work, whether peer-reviewed or not, should be taken into account in the review process unless full disclosure of sources and methods and procedures has been made and source code handed over, something which all reputable journals now insist on and which so far has not existed in climate science.
A very valid point. Let's just take a look at the wider picture at this point. Over recent years, climate change has become a mainstream political issue. At the very end of the Copenhagen Climate Conference in December, US President Barack Obama managed to cut a deal with China and other developed countries that became known as the Copenhagen Accord. In terms of the signatories agreed to attempt to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. A pledge was also made to provide billions of dollars over the next 3 years to assist developing countries in combating climate change. This is a non-binding agreement. Negotiations to formulate a legal commitment on the part of the world's largest economies is making little progress. At the G20 summit in Toronto last month, leaders who had agreed to the Copenhagen Accord reaffirmed their commitment to implementing it. And many now believe that the G20, which accounts for about 85% of the global economy, remains the best hope of managing climate change. It does appear, though, that there would need to be a leader in actually beginning to deal with this process. Fred Pearce, we heard David Henderson's opinion there that the basis of any action must be absolutely reputable and absolutely finely sourced. Would you agree with that point, first of all, the importance of the data on which action is taken being absolutely clear before the action is done?
I think they have to go at the same time. I think action has to be taken now. We cannot wait for absolute certainty. We'll probably never get absolute certainty. But I agree entirely with David that scientists have to clean up their act, have to be much more open about their data, much more open about their methods. And I'm quite confident that the big story that will emerge will be much the same as the story now. But some of these scientists started out on climate change or climate science when it was a kind of backwater area. It wasn't the subject of such overwhelming importance as it is today, and some of them need to, as I say, step up to the plate a little bit more and be a bit more rigorous in their work. But I don't believe that's going to change the big story. And at the end of the day, we are still stuck with doing something about the accumulation of these gases in the atmosphere. Now, politicians have been making dreadfully slow progress. After all, it's nearly 20 years since in Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit in 1992, they agreed to prevent dangerous climate change. They've now more or less agreed that dangerous climate change will be any warming more than 2 degrees. But they are really still at sea about how to achieve that aim. And the promises so far on the table in Copenhagen, and there'll be much the same promises on the table in Cancun in Mexico later this year, those promises don't add up yet to anything that will stop global warming at 2 degrees. It doesn't look like it. So they're going to have to come up with more, a lot more, and that is going to require particularly the US, but other industrialized nations, the ones that have been emitting for longest, to do the most and to really take the lead to develop the new technologies that we know are there. I mean, we know how to fix this problem. We know about the solar power and the wind power and the geothermal power and the nuclear power too, that could stop our reliance on burning these carbon-based fuels. But we've got to get on and do it, and the politicians have got to do a lot more work to agree a deal on that. I hope they can do it, but progress has been desperately slow.
Well, you mentioned there the United States. Now, although up until last year the US was the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, China becoming so last year, however, the details reveal that the US per capita still emits 4 times as much greenhouse gases as does China. Yet within the US, David Henderson, the Senate, for example, has not discussed the issue of climate change for 16 years since a UN document on that particular issue. Now, the US would appear, along with the other highly industrialized nations, to have an extra responsibility, would they not, to be able to begin addressing the situation, first as apparently or possibly a prime cause, but secondly as people who can lay the way ahead and have the resources to help others, less developed countries, do so. Your view, David Henderson?
Yes. I think if you start from the presumption, though I wouldn't myself make it a presumption, I'd say you start from the hypothesis that there could be a serious problem, then it's a world problem, and I think the responsibility rests on governments generally, more particularly on the governments of richer countries, but also on the large emitters everywhere. And my personal view, for which I get into trouble sometimes with some of my fellow skeptics, if you like to call them that, is that there should be a carbon price, which I would, a tax if you like, a charge on CO2, which would be in principle worldwide, combined with measures to help developing countries perhaps. However, though I don't disagree with Fred or with you that there's a strong case for action at the moment, simply because of the advice governments have received, I do think that the disposition, the commitment to action, should not be an absolutely firm one. How far the action should go, what form it should take in the future, should depend on how events unfold, and those events, to repeat, should be objectively assessed in a professional way through a process which now is not being provided. Policy commitments should not be regarded as firm into the indefinite future when you're dealing with a system which is not well known. And I think, though I may be quite wrong, and he knows more about it than I do, I think Fred Pearce is, well, I'm less confident of Fred Pearce that sufficient is known to provide the basis for commitments extending far into the future. I think in particular in this country, where we've gone further than perhaps any other, it's quite mistaken to suppose that it's sensible to lay down commitments for what you'll do right up to 2050 and the process up to that. It should be much more provisional, much more careful, much more dependent on evidence which should be objectively assessed in a way which is not now being done.
Well, a complicating factor, perhaps, Fred Pearce, in addition to what David Henderson was saying there as well, is the group of people who outrightly deny the existence of global warming. There are many interests involved in industrialized countries, big business, all sorts of factors come into play. How much of a problem do you think this is, the question of outright denial rather than the skepticism that we've heard advanced by David Henderson there?
Well, there aren't really many outright deniers. I think most people who've looked at this at all will tell you that, yes, we're going to have warming, and the only question is how much, exactly how the planet, if you like, responds to warming and whether it accelerates or manages to damp it down. So the scientific arguments are kind of around the margins. There aren't that many deniers, but I do agree they have a disproportionate influence because large corporations that burn a lot of coal and oil, some countries, including some in the Middle East, I might say, some of the biggest capita emitters are among the Gulf states, so don't forget them when we're talking about the US. But there are quite a lot of interests out there who want to downplay this for their own commercial or political interests. But I think, so this is always going to play out, but I think the science is increasingly strong. I think David is right that we should be wary of making long-term commitments which we can't change, because we are living in an era of scientific uncertainty about how climate change is going to play out. I think that's unavoidable. But on the other hand, you know, big corporations, if you're building a power station and you want to know whether to burn coal in it or natural gas, or whether to build a hydroelectric plant or a nuclear plant, you're taking decisions which have implications for your business for 30, 40 or 50 years ahead. So you need to be able to plan ahead. So we do need some framework under which governments and corporations can make decisions with some degree of certainty about exactly the emissions targets they're going to face in future decades. So that's a matter of the political reality. We need some agreement, but we mustn't lock everything in, so that if we discover, if some new science comes out that says we need to worry more about climate change because some tipping point is arising, or indeed if some research comes that shows we need to worry less, then we're going to need to be able to respond to that. But in the real political and commercial world, we ought to be setting targets that people can have some confidence in when they're making their long-term decisions. That's just the nature of the world.
Well, an interesting detail that has emerged, well, that has been widely known, for example, is that question of CO2, of carbon dioxide. Now, one study has found, for example, that before international industrial activity, there were 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now there are some 387 parts per million. This is a massive increase in the volume of carbon dioxide within the atmosphere. David Henderson, I want to get back to a very interesting point that you brought up there, the issue of a CO2 tax. Do you think that this is viable at present, and do you think it's desirable?
Yes, a quick comment, if you don't mind, on what Fred Pearce said. 2 points quickly. One is that I think he neglects the fact, though, that there are strong interests on both sides, not just on one. Second, I think he's quite right to stress that firms that are making investment commitments way ahead really need to have a firm basis for their decisions. But one of the few advantages of growing old, as I have, is that you see energy strategies and things of that sort, government commitments of that kind, turn out to be hopelessly wide of the mark. The fact is, it's very difficult to give a firm basis for planning, and governments constantly find that they're having to change their minds, and I suspect they'll have to in this case as well. Just one example, look at what's happening now to the gas market as a result of the development of shale gas. Now, CO2, can you do it? Yes, you can. It would be practicable to have a tax on CO2, and if that were done, and strong reliance were placed on it, it would be unnecessary, in my opinion, unnecessary to continue with much more expensive ways of reducing CO2 emissions, which at present are in force and being pushed ahead, like, for example, in this country, offshore wind farms, or wind farms generally.
Very briefly, Fred Pearce, your view on that issue of carbon dioxide tax.
A carbon tax would be a very good way of going forward. There are other options. You can have carbon trading systems, which are not dissimilar. But at any rate, we need to put a price on emitting carbon, because we know it's causing climate change, it's doing environmental damage to the planet, and the people that are emitting that carbon should pay a price for that. And hopefully, if they do, they'd think twice about doing it and would spend more money investing in the kind of renewable technologies that we know that we need. I think there's a very good case for saying we shouldn't be prescriptive about what happens here, that we should let the market decide, put a price on carbon emissions, and then let corporations and research bodies decide how they want to invest their money. I don't really believe in governments setting all the rules at the top. If they set a framework like a carbon tax or like carbon trading, and then let the market reach those commercially sensitive decisions, I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Well, on this point of agreement, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there, as we've run out of time, but ending at least on a point of agreement. My thanks to our guests, Fred Pearce and David Henderson in London. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.